what I want to do today is spend a little bit of time just to interview and talk with Ari Paul. This is a particularly meaningful interview for me because I didn't tell Ari this, but I was actually in the crowd just like you were a little over 2.5 years ago when he came and spoke in San Francisco at this little kind of underground meetup called Curious Conversations. And as I was listening to him, I was just thinking, man, that guy is smart. That guy really has some pretty meaningful ideas. It's really kind of interesting to get to hear him. So now I'm kind of extraordinarily humbled to have him as kind of someone who we are serving. He's one of our clients through Block Tower, and just really kind of looking forward to this conversation. And thank you for all you've done for crypto.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So it's almost a bit cliche to start this way, but I would say rather than asking, how did you get started in crypto, I would want to turn it on its head a little bit and say, what stopped you from getting started in crypto? Like, where were the areas where you kind of like weren't ready yet, but then eventually came over the hump?
So before I answer that, I just want to say it's a pretty humbling audience. Like when I used to give talks in 2017, it would be like, people who didn't know what a blockchain was. Almost anything was eye-opening. I look into the crowd and we've got like heads of OTC desks and fund managers, and a lot of people in the audience know more than me in their area of expertise, and maybe more than me about everything. So I'm up here very humbly, appreciative of the chance to chat and chat with Anchorage's CEO. So let me start with that genuine humility. Actually, and this kind of plays to the same theme. So I searched in 2017 for my email for the first reference I had to cryptocurrency. And I had totally forgotten ever receiving this email, but a really smart, creative thinking investor friend of mine had sent me an email in 2011 with a New York Times article on Bitcoin saying, I think this looks interesting. And I responded with 2 sentences saying, Bitcoin will never have value, or I said cryptocurrency will never have value because value comes from either a historical appreciation of value, like as in gold, or fiat backed by guns. So, that was my definitive dismissal of why crypto will never have value in 2011. And I totally forgot about that exchange, and I kind of rediscovered crypto in 2013 with the meteoric rise with a lot of people. And I was a very slow learner. It really took me a few years to gain conviction. I bought my first Bitcoin in early 2014, but didn't really know what it was or fully understand it. And so for me, it was a very gradual awakening. So I'm pretty appreciative of the slow process that people like Ray Dalio or Howard Marks seem to be going through. Because for me, I needed to be very slowly and gradually converted to the value proposition, which requires all these different pieces to come together to understand why, what can it be used for? Why does it have unique properties that make it particularly good at that? So for me, I think I needed to understand a little bit about all the pieces, about blockchain, about public-private key cryptography, about the demand for offshore bank accounts and depreciation resistance, about the game theory and proof of work, shelling points around how hard it is to change Bitcoin and why that gives us confidence in 21 million limit. So I think for me, it was like a very slow spiral learning those concepts that eventually congealed in late 2016.
So those thoughts kind of congeal in late 2016 for you, and then how long did it take you to go fully down the rabbit hole to say, hey, I'm gonna start a firm, I'm gonna start Block Tower, I'm gonna like take this to just kind of whatever it may have been, maybe it was just a hobby at the time, to like, hey, I'm gonna in many ways just devote my life to this cause?
Yeah. I think like what we've seen with crypto adoption, it's kind of slow and gradual and then sudden. So for me, it was kind of an accelerating process of excitement and learning. And then at some point in late 2016, I just felt like things clicked for me. Like I really understood the value proposition, why. I'll frame it this way. So like a question, everyone in the room, obviously, well, I don't know about everyone, but probably most of you are firm believers. I don't need to convince any of you of the underlying value proposition. But a question I get asked a lot is, could it all go away, right? Like potential investors in the space. And my answer is, you think about the banking system. Could every current bank go bankrupt? And the answer is yes. 2008 wasn't that far from that potentially happening. But if that happened, 5 years later, you're still going to have banks, right? If every airline company goes bankrupt, 5 years later, you're still going to have airlines because there's a fundamental value proposition there. Consumers demand banking, consumers demand air travel. And so even if existing entities die, you're going to have something that provides that service because there's demand for a unique value proposition that can't be served any other way. So things kind of clicked for me in 2016 that like cryptocurrency provides a service and several services that nothing else can anywhere close. And so while I would say today I'm not, I think Bitcoin is a good chance to win, but I'm not convinced that it'll even exist in 20 years. But something will. Some cryptocurrency will, or many will provide these value propositions. So in late 2016, that kind of clicked, and then from a few other angles, it clicked to throw my career and kind of bet my life on it. In that, one, I was at the University of Chicago endowment, and every conversation was about how alpha is very hard to find. I was doing research on things like risk premia, smart beta, where it's about like the second decimal point. It's trying to evaluate, very, very subtle things. Should you be buying with a P ratio of 11 or 12? What's the long-term equity return rate, to a single decimal point? And then here you have cryptocurrency, which is this incredibly nascent market where you have people like in late 2016, I think it was late 2016, Joel Monegro writing Fat Protocol thesis, Chris Bernisky doing work on velocity of money. This to me was like 1920 in equities. This was pre-Benjamin Graham value investor, which was so intellectually exciting. The chance to in an intellectual sense, to be exploring and talking with those people, to have a chance to maybe meaningfully contribute to the intellectual thought around how to think about these assets was so incredibly appealing as a student of economic history and as an investor.
Yeah, that ends up being pretty interesting. So one of the things you kind of touched on a little bit there is this idea that maybe Bitcoin might not be here in 20 years. And one of the most interesting conversations I've had during this week was with this family office actually, and this particular family office was very interested in just kind of brainstorming what are the things that could kill our Bitcoin investment? What are the things that specifically could hurt Bitcoin to the point that we would need to think about kind of starting to divest our position there? And we talked about things like maybe there's a cryptographic attack. Some people throw out like what would happen if Satoshi started moving his coins, his or her coins. So when you think about that 20-year time horizon where Bitcoin may not be here, what kind of comes to mind as events that could possibly precipitate such change?
This is fun for me that we get into something that's a little political and controversial, political within the context of the space. So proof of work has some really glaring vulnerabilities, and the original game theory in the white paper very clearly doesn't work when you include derivatives. It was never addressed by Satoshi or any of the early thinkers. Basically, under proof of work, the protection comes from the sunk cost of hardware. It's the fact that miners would lose, $500 million worth of hardware or more if they do a really aggressive series of double spend attacks. The problem is now that we have a robust derivative market that's fast growing, if you can establish a short position that is larger than all the cost of all the hardware combined, then there is a very clear incentive to try to attack and destroy Bitcoin in a purely economic sense. So why hasn't that happened? I think almost the interesting question, I think there's a really clear economic way that someone could profit from destroying Bitcoin as a purely economic actor. And I think, so why hasn't it happened? To accomplish that is operationally difficult, nowhere near impossible, but hard. So it would probably require, to do it as a non-state actor who can't, who doesn't want to use aggressive violence, like dropping bombs on mining centers, you'd probably need a few $1 billion to accumulate hash power quietly over a few years. You'd need the ability to quietly build new factories. So you're talking about a few $1 billion probably. And then you'd need a little bit of financial knowledge to establish a gigantic derivative position quietly. And then you'd need a little bit of mining and engineering knowledge to actually kind of devalue the network, make it impossible to use through controlling hash power. And you'd need to have the desire. So, the number of people in the world who have that money, like, I put it this way, I think Bill Gates could probably do it today if he wanted to, but why would he do it, right? Like, there is a bit of an ethical element here. But that is an existential concern. And I've never heard a good argument as to why this can't happen or won't happen. I think the solution, which I frankly I haven't had the time, but I'm trying to gently encourage people to do this. The only solution that I've ever been able to think of or hear of with proof of work is you need white knight coalitions. So exchanges started talking about this a little bit in the past year, which is if you had a concerted double spend attack by a state actor or a malicious economic actor, exchanges or miners could basically fight back through coordination. They could kind of do their own 51% attack in response. That's sometimes thrown out as trivial. So Andreas Antonopoulos, a brilliant mind who's done incredible work in the space, I only hold him in the highest regard. He used to, I don't know if he still says this, but he used to say that, oh, we don't need to worry about any of this stuff because the community will just fork these people off the network. They'll just blacklist IP addresses, they'll blacklist miner addresses, and you look at how hard it is to get the Bitcoin community to coordinate around anything, and I think that's so obviously completely wrong. You add in a little bit of a disinformation campaign. So this malicious actor, assume that they bribe or co-opt a few leading figures, a few luminaries, a few big names. They spread disinformation about which is the real Bitcoin, what's really happening. I think it would be extremely difficult in the spur of the moment, under that period of confusion, to coordinate a defensive response. And it would have to be very quick. So the hope, I think the best outcome here is probably that basically the whales, the key economic actors like exchanges, like giant miners, coordinate in advance, have a plan of response in advance so that the community can successfully either respond with hash power or with a hard fork or with a client update that blacklists IP addresses. And that by itself probably isn't enough because it's easy to rotate IP addresses, I know, but basically I think you need a plan in advance and good communication channels to try to coordinate that. So long story short, proof of work has some very clear vulnerabilities without really simple solutions. So if Bitcoin doesn't exist in 20 years, I think it's because the proof of work model, at least as it stands today, proved insufficient.
Yep. Talk about China.
In this context in particular, I don't know if I have anything. I'll probably say what you're thinking or implying. Well, so China's very frequently controlled majority of Bitcoin hash power. They have strong economic incentives to have their hardware be valuable, to have their Bitcoins that they've collected be valuable, as well as the institutional infrastructure to continue pumping out. You know, there is value to Bitmain as an R&D firm, as an ongoing concern. My concern was never that Jahan of Bitmain or anyone else would corner the market. It was always that because as an individual, especially pre-derivatives, they had very strong incentive to be supportive. The concern was that if a small number of individuals in China control 51% of hash power, it's trivially easy for the Chinese government to make them do whatever they want, right? I mean, trivial. So a big part of the benefit of having lots of nodes, there was such a big debate over the 1 megabyte block size limit to incentivize geographic diversification. And I think the key idea here is geographic diversification across regimes so that no one government can easily do that. That's why, like, having more nodes in China probably does nothing. Having more nodes in the U.S. does nothing. That one node in Siberia, those 30 nodes in rural India are super valuable in this regard. Here I'm talking about nodes, not hash power, but at least those nodes can be the backbone of a hard fork, and worst case, it's maybe a forking of the proof of work algorithm. I have no idea what China's plans are. I was frankly surprised. This is a topic we were talking about getting into, and apologies for monologuing, but so I don't know anything better than anyone in the room here what China really plans. I was surprised after Xi's announcement was a surprise, and then I expected there to be a step back after that, something like, hey guys, we meant blockchain, not Bitcoin, not Ethereum. I thought actually, our investment team, we were debating this internally, and and I said, I predict that in the next month there'll be a negative regulatory shock out of China as a response to the excitement, the scams, the headlines. But we've seen the opposite. So there was a ban on Bitcoin mining in China that was slated to happen in the next 6 months. How real that would have been, who knows? But that was rolled back. Bitcoin has been referenced positively in Chinese education materials repeatedly. Basically, it's been purely positive about public cryptocurrencies, permissionless cryptocurrencies out of China. What's their long-term plan? What are the real conversations happening? Is it one interesting hypothesis is that it's something like mercantilism. That mercantilism is the idea that if you accumulate the world's gold, you win as a country, which modern economists kind of dismiss, but there's some element of that maybe to China's thinking. Certainly, if Bitcoin's going to be a thing, the Chinese government would rather as much Bitcoin as possible be owned in China. And there is some evidence they're thinking along that lines in that their constant bans of Bitcoin were really bans about transferring it out of the country indirectly. So it's like, okay, you can be a Bitcoin miner, we'll even subsidize your electricity, but you can't sell it overseas. And you could run a crypto exchange, but only if it's regulated, registered, and monitored. And there's some evidence that that's partly to basically keep the Bitcoin in China and have it be easily tracked by the Chinese government, so the Chinese government kind of controls it. That's an interesting idea to me. How firm of an opinion is that? Like, is that really a plan, or is that more like, we don't know what's going to happen with Bitcoin, we don't know what we're going to do in a year, but in the meantime, let's control it? I don't know.
So when you look at kind of China's actions here, I kind of am with you that it's in aggregate kind of hard to read. Some folks are saying, hey, they're trying to shut this down. Others are saying, hey, there's maybe a case to be made that decentralized currency is getting kind of a foothold in the world. Deplatform the U.S. dollar's position as kind of a world currency, which could be desirable if you were, say, in a trade war with the U.S., for example. So what do you think of kind of that notion and how that plays into how the U.S. ought to be thinking about things like Libra as we look at how do we maintain competitiveness? How do we look at ways to have the U.S. kind of be a top tier player within the global economic system, kind of on an enduring basis?
Yeah, so China has long eyed kicking the dollar off the pedestal. Not that the yuan will replace it as global reserve, but I think we're headed towards a bipolar world. China's been doing a lot of very specific things, very concrete things over the last decade. They set up bilateral trade agreements that are settled in yuan. They basically central bank clearing between China and Russia and China and a lot of other countries. They've been making giant investments throughout their sphere of influence, Southeast Asia, Africa, and providing loans in yuan that have to be repaid in yuan. Basically, they're creating their own fiat ecosystem of basically Southeast Asia and I don't know exactly how far it goes. Maybe they're trying to include Eastern Europe and Russia and certainly large swaths of Africa and maybe small pieces of South America they seem to be targeting now. Is Bitcoin part of that play? I have to imagine it comes up in some conversations, but I have no idea to what degree. They certainly, until the Xi announcement and this stuff, there was no evidence that they were taking it that seriously. It's almost a different 2 orders of magnitude. So as an analogy, in 2017, one of the Federal Reserve governors, thank you, governors, was asked before Congress, is Bitcoin a concern for U.S. interest rates, monetary policy? And their answer was not yet. Their answer was it's way too small. If it increases by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, then we'll have to think about it as how it impacts policy. So for China, Bitcoin was trivial. So China didn't care about Bitcoin as a way to evade capital controls because so much more money was evading capital controls through simpler channels of fiat to Hong Kong, for example. So it just almost wasn't on the radar, and it didn't seem like they were treating it at that level of strategic planning the same way they were very aggressively setting up these bilateral trade agreements and trying to really establish the yuan. That may be changing now. Certainly, we know China's trying to establish the yuan as one of the global reserve currencies. So now, what should the U.S. be doing? It's in the U.S.'s interest, certainly, to keep the dollar as strong as possible, as long as possible, to fight that off as much as they can. I think it's inevitable. Unless China collapses under its own weight, the U.S. dollar will lose its status as the solo global reserve within the next decade, I think. It's such a clear trend in all regards, including just military and consumer economic power. That will be much faster if we have a horribly obsolete currency that no one wants to use for technical reasons. I mean, it's almost comical. The dollar doesn't work on weekends. It's almost comical. So the FedNow system is being explored. My guess is that'll end up getting expanded. I'm not an expert on this, but for those who aren't familiar, the Fed has been talking for a long time about doing something like a fiat cryptocurrency. And the current proposal is called FedNow, and that not a Trump coin. Yeah. Trump. There's got to be a better pun. I've been trying to think of puns for that. The best I heard for Libra was Zuckbucks, or what is it? Face marks, right? Because Deutschmarks. I haven't tried to think of a Trump one. So I think there will be clear pressure. A great line that I heard from a friend recently was maybe we're entering a period of like chess diplomacy. So in the Cold War, any chess fans out there, the Fischer versus Boris Spassky matches became almost a weird central focus for the U.S. Soviet Union Cold War. Blockchain may become something like that, where it becomes a very popular political talking point, even if it's not super economically relevant immediately. The hope for all of us in this room is that the U.S. regulators and politicians feel competitive pressure, and that makes them, accelerate or at least take the foot off the brakes, certainly.
Yeah, that one's kind of interesting. So just to kind of riff on that idea a little bit, Fischer famously wins those games by doing something totally unexpected, right? He opened with an opening that he had never used before and had never had the chance to be studied. So what are kind of things that you think are going to happen that we're going to be surprised about? What are kind of the unexpected things coming over the next maybe 3 to 5 years that we don't necessarily see coming, or are ways to kind of change the game in ways that we can't really necessarily conceive of right now?
So I don't know how surprising that at this point this may be almost consensus, but when I would say this 18 months ago, people would stare at me like I had 3 heads. So I don't know how many of you guys have read The Sovereign Individual. If you haven't, I would highly recommend it. Let me start with a caveat. Something I love about The Sovereign Individual, which is probably the most recommended book in the cryptocurrency world, and it long predates cryptocurrency, by the way. It starts with a prediction about the Y2K bug. It starts by saying basically there will be a bug in computers in the year 2000 that will create havoc. So I love books like that start so wrong, because these kind of sociological prediction models are not science, but they are thought-provoking and interesting. And The Sovereign Individual lays out a pretty logical series of steps that I think are very likely to happen, that we're seeing play out, which is governments like China have incredibly strong incentives to roll out what we're seeing them roll out, with DCEP is the current title for it. Crypto fiat is what I'm calling it. I don't know a better name, where they get total control over everything. So the Treasury departments love it because they get total transparency into all economic activity, which is every economist's dream. Tax collectors love it, right, because they actually get perfect tax collection. Law enforcement loves it because they can track every legal payment. The public loves it because it is a much better UI, right? Unlike the dollar, it means the currency works 24/7. You get all the great data, and the same reason we like PayPal and Venmo more than the wire system. You can just have a great user experience when you centralize that way and have total data transparency to the person running the system. So kind of every entity wants this to happen, except for people who fear the government, basically. And so what happens next? Well, this is where things get scary. And so this is the 3-head side of or not quite yet, but I'll get there very quickly. So what happens after you roll out this totally government-controlled currency that allows an algorithm? So if you have a credit card, at some point, your credit card may have been frozen by an algorithm. And then you had to call your credit card provider and tell them, no, it's not fraudulent. Imagine when algorithms can turn off all of your money because you made an unpatriotic social media post. That's where China's probably going to be in a year or 18 months or 2 years at most. So the wealthy, previously, if you were an oligarch in Russia or China, you could flee the country with a lot of money, but not the country's wealth, right? If you owned a nickel mine in Russia, you couldn't exit with that. If you're Jack Ma of Alibaba, you're not getting out of the country with the bulk of your wealth. With cryptocurrency, if it continues to scale, potentially you can. Potentially an oligarch can flee the country with 1% of GDP because it's a password in your head. And the government has no way to stop that except one, which is to close the border. So a concrete prediction, and this is somewhat true in China today, but I think it's going to become much more heavily enforced, is you're going to have a closed border in China and in many other countries. This is where the 3-headed prediction comes in, and I'm just parroting Sovereign Individual on this, but I agree with the logic. The next step is you can't control a porous border, especially not from the wealthy and powerful. A billionaire is always going to be able to find an escape out of China. And so if they can do that and they can leave with 2% of GDP with a password in their head, what'll happen is a lot of them will flee to a small number of countries or places that are kind of safe havens. Maybe that's, in the sovereign individual, I think they suggest New Zealand because it's fairly close to China, a lot of open land, nice place. And so the crazy prediction is then you get physical war. So if a lot of billionaires are fleeing China and taking good chunks of the country's economy with them, and they're all going to New Zealand, at some point China finds an excuse to attack New Zealand. I think trying to say that that will happen, it would be foolhardy, but I think it's more than 50-50 that we see that within 10 years, that we see a physical war from a country with closed borders to prevent people from escaping with permissionless cryptocurrencies.
Maybe to bring that one just a little too close to home, Ray Dalio talked about something pretty similar in his recent thing about kind of everything being kind of out of whack right now, where he says there's going to be this notion that we'll see increased tax rates on the wealthy will try to flee, and then maybe even Western countries might try to prevent flight in the same way. So do you share Ray's concern there, and do you think cryptocurrency might be a path to help in those kind of cases, or do you think he's also a three-headed monster like yourself?
It's harder to see imminently in most Western democracies. It just a lot needs to happen for us to get there. So I totally agree with Ray that we're going to see. I mean, the U.S. already did this with an exit tax. So it used to be 20 years ago, if you renounced your citizenship, you could leave with your money. You had to pay any back taxes you owed, but you could say, I'm renouncing I'm a wealthy hedge fund manager. I'm renouncing my citizenship. I'm relocating my hedge fund to Singapore. And I'm going to make my money there. I think it was called the Eduardo Saverin bill, where Facebook co-founder Eduardo Saverin basically did that. He left the country with a huge amount of Facebook stock that was like unrealized profits. He did not owe much tax on it because he hadn't realized it. And Congress passed a law specifically addressing that now says you owe an exit tax. I don't remember what the rate is, but it's pretty high. Maybe it's 20% or 30%. So it's not insane, but it is pretty punitive. So we kind of already have that. That'll probably get more extreme. Maybe that rate will go much higher. Enforcement will get stronger. At the moment, it's hard to see us physically closing the border. With that said, there are a lot of countries that are heading in that direction. We're getting weird anti-liberty kind of laws coming out of the UK, Australia. I mean, for example, in Australia recently passed a law that makes it illegal to have end-to-end encryption. They have to give, if you're running Signal in Australia, you have to give the government a backdoor. Otherwise, you're committing not a criminal offense currently, it's civil, but you owe outrageous fines as penalties. Pretty crazy, right? I and another person cannot legally communicate in an encrypted form, which I would have said it is hard to imagine coming from, modern Western, or not in the West in this case, but democracies.
Actually went as far as, in that law, allowing the government to deputize individual engineers to backdoor and not even disclose to their employers. Is that right?
I don't know. Yeah. Sorry.
So it was actually quite a interesting kind of approach there. So we talked a bit about China, talked about capital flight. One of the things that's kind of also interesting at the geopolitical scale here is Russia and everything that's going on kind of in the Russian area. One of the ones that kind of maybe hit close to home to us here in the crypto community is everything that went on with Telegram, and there was no kind of explicit notion that was based on the fact that it's kind of based in Russia. But what are your thoughts on the Telegram situation? Do you think it resolves, and how do you think about it as a either bellwether or harbinger for crypto as a whole?
So honestly, I have no idea. I'm familiar at a high level with the Telegram story, but not. I haven't followed it super closely. I don't know. I don't know how much of it is idiosyncratic with the founder of Telegram being so explicitly kind of giving the middle finger to Putin and to the Russian government in general. So I don't know how much of it is targeted versus just a general distaste. Unlike China is really clearly rolling out kind of like a dystopian, Orwellian, total control state. Russia seems, in my very amateurish, just kind of reading the same headlines everyone else is, much more opportunistic. It's more about personal power grabs and relationships between Putin and oligarchs. So I don't know if there's like as clear a strategy. I don't know if the Russian government has a clear view on what they want to do about cryptocurrency. Certainly, there's plenty of individuals there getting rich on it, and I could imagine them taking that perspective that, hey, let's just have Putin and our buddies, manipulate it or get rich off it. So I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, kind of hard to read. Maybe let's switch gears a little bit. How are you feeling? Kind of, you're an institutional investor. You kind of know a lot of institutional investors. Where are you seeing kind of bright spots in the industry, and where are you seeing areas where we still need to kind of build things up? I know when I saw you in this context 2 years ago, you were saying, hey, custody needs to get solved. But what are the areas now where you're saying, hey, we need more infrastructure here, we need more solutions, and then what are the areas where you're kind of seeing kind of maturity come to the space?
I think the two really obvious glaring problems right now are one, liquidity fragmentation and concentration on unregulated / illegal exchanges that are also incredibly high counterparty risk. So there's a real problem that like we even face as an investor in the space, which is you don't need to be that big. You don't need to be trying to do billion-dollar trades. If you're just trying to trade 10, 20, $30 million of Bitcoin, it's tough if you're only on U.S. regulated exchanges. And even if you're on all the global regulated exchanges combined, so much liquidity is on these exchanges that are in either a gray zone or a black zone that it's really hard to be a participant in the market if you're not going to access that liquidity. So the liquidity fragmentation creates its own problems, but the fact that so much liquidity is on these exchanges that people should be wary of from various angles. I'm not saying you shouldn't trade on them. I'm just saying, this is so unrelated. In the traditional financial world, you don't have to worry about the NYSE as a counterpart. You don't have to worry about the CME. The idea of asking a pension to be week by week underwriting BitMEX and Bitfinex and the creditworthiness or Binance, is just not going to happen. So that's a challenge. I'm not sure how that plays out. I think, frankly, this would be painful in the short term, but a good long-term outcome for the industry would actually be if the regulators kind of applied the rules, and that would force some liquidity to the more regulated, trustworthy exchanges. It's somewhat similar. Here's my rant about regulation. The worst way to regulate a market is to create a bunch of rules and not enforce them. Because what you do then is you ensure that the winners will be bad actors, or at least people who don't care about the rules. This is true in ride sharing. This is true, and it's certainly true in crypto, where custodians that tried to go through the proper channels of getting the licensing they need, exchanges that are trying to follow all the rules, are at a massive competitive disadvantage to an exchange that doesn't do AML KYC, or an exchange that doesn't follow all the processes they need, that takes gray market money that Coinbase wouldn't take. So the regulation in the space has ensured that the largest players are gray market or black market. I hope that changes so that we get more trustworthy. And it's not. Let me be clear. It's not that I'm pro-regulation or a fan of regulation. What I'm saying is the worst scenario is this middle ground, which is not. It's not the Goldilocks like happy middle. It's the worst. It's you have effectively heavy regulation that is not enforced. So the people who are trying to follow the regulation get outcompeted by the people who aren't, and nothing prevents them. That's also been true in the ICO market with Block One and Blockstack is a good juxtaposition. Block One, got a slap on the wrist for a $4 billion raise. Blockstack spent $2.5 million on legal fees to do a proper raise, and the reward for that is a less liquid token, less money raised. They're at such a big competitive disadvantage because they followed the rules, and there didn't seem to be much of a penalty for not following the rules. So that's one. The exchange issue, liquidity issue is a big problem. The other is I'll put under the umbrella of prime brokerage. Right now, crypto transfers are insane. So the fact that you would ask a pension to transfer $100 million by copying and pasting a public key is insane. Even a lot of the existing custodians, and we are a client, and we're very happy with Anchorage's security processes, but a lot of the existing custodians, it's at that level. It's like if you ask them, I want to deposit a bunch of money, they show you an address on your screen and you send it, right? And that's it. And there's no way to confirm the address. There's no way to confirm there wasn't a man-in-the-middle attack, a virus on your computer. And that's so amateurish. And it's I don't really mean to insult the firms. That's just the state the industry's in. But the idea that we're going to have billion-dollar transfers by a bureaucracy based on an alphanumeric string on one person's computer screen is a non-starter, right? That's not the way the industry is going to scale and grow. So I think that the solution to this, which lots of people are working very hard on and doing a great job on, it's slow, is we're going to end up with more of a prime brokerage model where there's a handful of firms that are custodians. They're integrated so that if I want to do a transfer from Coinbase to Gemini, I don't need to copy and paste an alphanumeric string. I can identify a user on that account and send it to a user who's already verified. You'll be able to settle with OTC desk the same way. You'll be able to transfer from your custodian to an OTC desk without ever having to copy and paste these strings. And it does a lot. So it's a much better user experience. It is much better security, and it enables all sorts of ancillary services like a much more liquid lending market much more easily. At the moment, a question I've been getting asked a lot recently is is there a credit bubble in crypto? Because there's outrageous interest rates on Bitcoin loans, for example. You can potentially get double-digit interest rates on a Bitcoin loan. And I think the answer is a clear no right now because the credit outstanding is pretty tiny as a percentage. But I think it very clearly could become one in the next couple of years, and that would be a very real problem. So there's a lot of great platforms for lending. People don't understand the risk they're taking. I think it's somewhat similar to traditional finance pre-financial crisis, where you had pensions investing in CDOs with no idea what they were investing in terms of the risk they were taking. So people think they're getting paid 11% to loan Bitcoin. What's actually happening is they're actually buying a corporate bond from an extremely risky startup, and that's what they're doing. They're lending money to an incredibly risky startup for 11%. And they would never do that. If I said, do you want to lend money to BlockFi at 11%, that's maybe collateralized, but you don't even have any idea to what extent. And I don't mean to pick on BlockFi. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong at all. I'm just saying the people making those loans are not thinking about it in the right context. So prime brokerage kind of fixes all this. And let me be clear, I am I was going to say cypherpunk, but I shouldn't say that. What I will say is I very, very much appreciate the idea of own your own keys, be your own bank. All of that I would encourage people to do. But for institutions, it should also be possible to do it in a way that is safe, secure, and easy for a bureaucracy. And by bureaucracy, I mean like an endowment. I worked at the Chicago Endowment for 4 years. Who's going to hold the keys, right? When we say not your keys, not your coin, well, you have an endowment with 30 employees. Who's supposed to hold those keys? So there needs to be an institutional infrastructure around this for institutions. Individuals absolutely use your own hardware wallet.
So appreciate you giving the kind of the Anchorage pitch there. I truly did not ask him to do that, but I owe you one. Maybe one to kind of tie up here with a little bit of a fun question. A lot of investors like to think of themselves kind of as contrarians, as folks that kind of look at ways to disagree with the consensus. And I suppose in some way, being in cryptocurrency, we're all kind of fighting consensus opinion in the world at large. But I'd say within crypto, do you feel like you have points of view that are running contrary to what most people would believe, even within our community?
Yeah, crypto has a lot of very different opinions, right? You've got Bitcoin maximalists who are sure everything else is a scam. You've got ETH maximalists. You've got people chasing every utility token and confident that every rewards point token is worth $100 million. You have such differentiation of view that it's almost hard to think about what's contrarian. I think the first killer dApps are probably sooner than most people think. We've been a little bit scarred, right? So everyone who went through 2017 and got pitched all of these utility tokens, there's a little bit of a man, none of that worked. And so we've kind of, some people are still very optimistic, of course, but a lot of people are none of this stuff is anywhere near on the horizon. I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to get some very simple, viral killer dApps, and I think they're very likely to be things like games. Thinking about the history of almost every technology, there's basically two initial use cases every time, pornography and gaming. It's actually funny, I get asked sometimes, what investment do I regret not making? And in crypto, you would just drive yourself crazy, right? There's so many things that went up 100x in 2017. But the one that I regretted not making, which is a long-term investment, seems like it didn't do well, but a friend told me to look at SpankChain 2 years ago. And I was like, dude, I'm busy. And he's like, you can stake it and get booty. And I kind of scoffed. And it, at least for a period, did extremely well. And I really regretted not looking at it because I like to think of myself as a little bit of an amateur student of economic history. And it's so clear that when there's a new technology, you look for applications in pornography and gaming. That's been true like 30 times with every new technology. So we are heavy investors in crypto gaming. It's still early for sure, but I think we're finally going to see within the next year the first set of crypto games that are playable as just games, where if you didn't know they were crypto, you would still enjoy playing them. They would still have a chance of going viral just as good games. The scalability issues are solved via sidechains. These things don't need crazy security. So it's really just, it's pretty close. That's an area that I follow a little more closely. I think
Those are on Ethereum, or do you think there'll be other layer ones that'll be better suited to the game use case?
it actually doesn't matter much. So all you're storing is very, very simple records of ownership of items. You're not playing the game on a chain. So these games probably should be built so they're played on Amazon Cloud. What you care about is the ownership. What you care about is the record of the assets. You don't care if the graphics rendering is done on a decentralized chain, right? All you care about is kind of the economic side. So frankly, it could be run on many, many different layer ones. And side chains and plasma chains on that. I don't know what the best tech is, but it actually isn't a tech problem at this point. It's to the extent it is, it's just about creating new standards like ERC20 type standards that are just convenient and standardized.
Well, Ari, this has been a real pleasure. If we could give Ari a round of applause, appreciate that. Thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks.